Hey guys, this week I'm really excited. I've brought on Danny Lennon from Sigma Nutrition, who is my nutrition coach, as well as he's about to say that he's not, but he's one of my close friends as well. And we're going to talk about the subject of aggressive dieting. So, Danny, for anybody who doesn't know you, can you please introduce yourself and let them know who you are and what do you do?
Yes, so I think the quickest way is that I run a company called Sigma Nutrition, where we essentially focus on putting out information about evidence-based nutrition as it relates to performance and body composition typically. So we have a coaching service that works one-on-one with people online, and then we do a lot of educational stuff. So we're probably best known for the podcast Sigma Nutrition Radio. We run seminars, events, workshops, that type of stuff. So, yeah, that's me. My own background was a master's degree in nutritional sciences from UCC. And before that, I had done biology and physics education, followed by a year of teaching before going back to do my master's. And yeah, from there, just kind of progressed over time. And Sigma Nutrition's up probably 3-4 years now at this stage. And yeah, here we are.
Awesome, sweet. So actually, you just touched on that you run seminars, and that is actually where I heard first about this method of aggressive dieting as actually a good tool to utilize. I would have fallen into the spectrum most people do, where they think, okay, when you're on a diet, you're going to take however many calories away and just keep that consistent every day over a long period of time. So you were actually the first person that kind of put me onto aggressive dieting as a real method. But first, can you explain what an aggressive diet is?
Yeah, sure. So I think typically when people think of going into a dieting phase or what's the best way to diet, there's a few things that people think of as like rules or things that they have to do. And so during the talk of that seminar, I was just essentially talking about how to be a bit more critical about some of this stuff and think, is it actually the case? And so one of those typical rules or things people think is a good way to go is to lose weight, very slow, sustainable manner. Typically people talk about aim for about 1 pound a week or half a kilo a week. And then that can obviously go a bit higher or lower depending on how lean someone is. But typically the aim is to lose at a very easy, steady rate, and that's done through a pretty mild calorie deficit. So something maybe like 15 to 20% of their calories are reduced to get that rate of weight loss. And so essentially all aggressive diet is just going for a faster rate of weight loss by using a larger calorie deficit. So there's no like defined terms within the scientific literature, but like a lot of people might think of it as, like I said, a mild deficit would be something around 15% maybe. Then you look at something between 20 to 25 might be a bit more moderate, getting towards a bit more aggressive. And then something up the higher end of maybe 30% or more, we would say is quite an aggressive type of diet. So it's really more of a spectrum than one type of thing. But really the idea is the more aggressively you cut your calories, and therefore the faster you're going to lose weight, is more of an aggressive diet. And so what we talked about in that seminar was the idea that, well, it might not be as black and white as a aggressive diet is always bad for some of the reasons people think, and then therefore everyone has to use a sustainable diet in all different ways. So I'm sure we'll get onto some of that stuff, but essentially that's what we're talking about with an aggressive diet, just losing weight faster through a much larger calorie deficit.
I think a lot of the stuff in the seminar was kind of based around sort of an extremely overweight or obese population, and how it's important to try and get them to drop down as much weight as possible because they are at a health risk. So, that brings me to what population can utilize an aggressive style diet. Is it only for obese people that are at a health risk, or can it be utilized for performance and physique athletes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think starting with the place of someone that's very overweight or obese is just an easy way to bring up one example of why it might be useful. So if we can get weight off in a relatively quick manner, it does a few things. One is, like you say, no matter what method someone uses, if someone is obese and they lose a significant amount of body weight, all their health markers typically improve. You can get a blood test and everything seems to improve. But on top of that, from a very like psychological perspective, it increases their initial buy-in to the process. They're making good progress early on. They're maybe starting to build a bit more trust, or at least because they have so much weight to lose, it might be a bit disheartening to say, okay, we're going to lose at a very slow rate. So it makes sense to people to say, okay, if someone's extremely overweight, we can try and diet them faster. But really, when it comes to other people, there's not too many limitations on who it can't be used for. It more comes down to the individual within there. So to try and think of some cases where it probably isn't a good idea, we probably have to think of why an aggressive diet might not be a good idea. So typically the main two things people talk about of why an aggressive diet is probably not a good strategy is, number one, the risk of losing muscle mass, and then number two, in addition to it being like just hard to do because you're eating less calories, the fact that at the end of the diet it may predispose someone to binging more or consuming more because they've been so restrictive. And the thing is, when you look through the literature, you don't really see that picture emerge. Like, there's studies showing that people who have gone on very fast weights of weight loss through a high amount of caloric restriction, they typically can maintain that progress into the longer term, even compared to groups that lost at a slower rate. And so in general, there doesn't seem to be that idea that it will definitely cause a binge at the end. Now, that's where it comes the difference between on average versus the individual, because there's certainly people that I don't think it's suited to. And so I think rather than say who is it best suited to, it's probably easiest to think of who would definitely want to stay away from it. So if it's someone who, when they cut their calories significantly, they feel that at the end of that diet, they're more likely to overshoot and consume way more, maybe it's not the best strategy. The second would be for like a performance-based athlete during their competition season. So that's not to say they can never use it, but when they're using it in say it's an athlete that has an in-season and an off-season. So when they have competitions coming up or they have a lot of hard training to do, an aggressive diet is probably not a good idea, because less calories means less ability to perform at a high level. More calories is going to be useful. So maybe they want to keep that until the off-season when they're not competing. And then the final one would be probably someone who is already very lean that is dieting for a specific purpose. And this typically is someone that's doing bodybuilding or a physique show or maybe doing a photo shoot, and they're in their final dieting down phase, so that like towards the tail end of a contest prep. Because at that stage, because they're so lean already, using a large calorie deficit and trying to lose weight fast is just going to mean that there is going to be more muscle mass actually lost during that time. And so if at the end of their diet they have to stand on stage with the goal of having as much muscle as they can at that time, it's probably not a good idea. And so they might start out with a faster rate of weight loss early in the prep or during a mini cut, for example. But as that goes down towards the rest of the prep and they're getting towards the tail end of it, you want to have slower and slower rates of weight loss. And so for them types of people, it's probably not a good idea to use a very aggressive or large calorie deficit. But that said, there's all sorts of circumstances where you could pick where those types of populations could use it. So you could have a bodybuilder in the off season doing a mini cut, and we'll probably talk about some examples there where they could use a more aggressive type of diet. You could have an athlete that's in the off season before they come back to their main preseason work where they can use it. You can have people that are already very lean that can use an aggressive diet, but they just do it for a short period of time as they sort of extended. So really, that there's a few people that might want to consider if it's a good idea or not. And then the final one is just on an individual basis. Anyone has to think, is this actually something that I'm going to find useful? Because some people would hate the idea of having very low calories and dieting super hard, and they prefer to have a much milder deficit but just diet for a bit longer, where some people prefer the opposite. They prefer to diet for a much shorter period of time, so say 7 weeks as opposed to 12, but during that time they feel okay cutting their calories by a lot more just because they know it's going to be a shorter time period. So there's some kind of typical people that might want to look at.
Awesome, sweet. And so like a lot of it is dependent on what sort of phase in your training or phase in your year you are in relation to whatever show or competition you have coming up. That's going to kind of dictate whether you can utilize an aggressive diet at that time. How long would you typically structure an aggressive diet like that? Because as we said, it's not sustainable. Kind of what rate of weight loss is there, or percentage of weight loss, or anything like that would you use as a marker to decide how long you'd continue an aggressive diet?
Yeah, so this is more thinking about it's probably going to be very similar to the way someone would do even if they were doing a more moderate weight loss. So if they're aiming for, okay, I'm going to go very slow and steady, aim for half a kilo a week, they'll generally have in mind what level of leanness they want to get through during this diet. And then that level of leanness is going to dictate how many weeks they need to diet for. So if they aim to lose, say, 8 kilos, or 4 kilos, for example, that's going to cause them to say, okay, I'm going to diet now for the next 8 weeks at half a kilo a week. So using that as the same kind of thing, you can just say, okay, if I go a bit more aggressively and lose at a faster weight, I'm still going to lose the same amount of body weight as I planned and the same amount of body fat, but I'm just going to do it in a shorter period of time. So then it really just comes down to monitoring body weight averages on a weekly basis, and then comparing how that's going each week, how their physique is coming along, how they're feeling in training, if the diet is still something they're able to do, and then really being able to essentially just eat at a low enough level that the weight is dropping as however fast they want. And this comes down to if they want it to go faster, or they feel they can eat a bit less, then they're going to have a bit larger of a deficit, or if they need to have more food, they'll add it back in. And then how long they run that diet is just until they get to that point of what that leanness level that they were actually aiming for in the first place comes to. So it's not really going to change the kind of target for that phase. It's just going to change the time frame. So instead of dieting 8 or 10 weeks, they're instead just going to do a short 5-week mini cut, for example, and get the same weight loss done in that time, and then transition back into a maintenance or a gaining phase then.
So they're just doing things a little bit tougher for some people, a little bit tougher in order to do it in a quicker amount of time so they can almost get back on the horse even quicker.
Yeah, and that's really where I think it comes down to the individual and how they prefer to diet, in that it's going to be some people prefer the idea of like, just I want to get in and get out. I want to get the dieting done as in a short period of time, and then get back to either maintenance or get back into a gaining phase to be able to start building some muscle again. And so therefore their mini cut during, say, the off season, which is the example you gave, is going to be dictated by using a more aggressive diet to get some body fat down, get lean, and then transition back up. Whereas someone else might just take a bit longer time period, but not diet as aggressively. So it'll take them a bit longer, but it means they can have more food. Their performance will probably be better in that time. And if there is going to be some loss in lean body mass, it'll be a bit less. But generally, that's not as big a concern as I think a lot of people think that it is.
Awesome, sweet. So just kind of to wrap things up a bit, can you sum up the pros and cons of dieting aggressively?
I think the main cons are the best place to start, because I think the main reasons why people don't want to do it. Number one, it's just at that time point, it's harder on a day-to-day basis because you are eating less food, and that's never fun. Secondly, it's going to impact your performance to a much greater degree. So if you care about your performance in the gym, or you're competing in a certain sport, it will probably be worse during that time period because you have less calories coming in. Third is a kind of, and this kind of again depends on the person, but for some people an aggressive diet is just not psychologically appealing. They don't like the idea of dieting on that low amount of calories. Then I said the fourth one would probably be the increased risk of losing lean body mass. But again, I think people have to realize that in general, if your training is still a good stimulus and you're getting sufficient amounts of protein, then the amount of lean body mass most people are going to lose is going to be fairly negligible anyway. And then even if you do lose some lean body mass on an aggressive diet, for most people, I would question how much does that actually matter. So, for example, we know that with a bodybuilder, it 100% matters, because at the end of the diet, they're going to be judged on not only how lean they are, but the amount of muscle mass they have. But for someone else who's not competing, say they diet and they do lose a bit more lean body mass, it's not going to be substantial. So just say it's going to be a small bit more than if they did a more sustainable diet. But once they finish that diet, they're going to be out and not dieting and on higher calories than if they did a slower sustainable diet. So they have more weeks of being at maintenance or above, and so they're going to be able to start gaining that muscle back. And what we know about people who have detrained or have lost previous muscle mass is that it's much easier to gain it back than it is to build in the first place. And so it's going to be relatively straightforward to have a quick jump back. So I don't think it's going to be a problem for most people. But again, that is a potential risk. So for someone that's dieting for, like we say, bodybuilding, physique, photo shoot, et cetera, it might be not a good idea. So those are the kind of main cons that I think of. And then, like we mentioned earlier, for some people, they may be predisposed to binging or consuming a lot more food at the end of the diet if they've been super, super restrictive throughout. But again, that's a very individual thing. In terms of the pros, it's kind of a lot of the opposites of those. Number one, I think, is for a lot of people, it's more psychologically appealing, and that's purely because it decreases the length of time you have to diet for. So yeah, it might be harder on a day-to-day basis, but you're actually only dieting for a much shorter period of time. So like we said, rather than 12 weeks, it might be 7 weeks, or just as an example.
Take it harder in the short term in order to, instead of being moderately hard on the long term.
Right, yeah. So it's more of an acute hit that it's harder, but people might even prefer that. It's like, okay, I don't mind using a bit more willpower or having lower calories or a bit less energy for a few weeks because I know it'll be done quicker. And so for some people, it's psychologically appealing that way. I think it allows a buy-in for a lot of people. So particularly like we mentioned with very overweight or obese people who have a lot to lose, getting a bit of momentum and getting bought into the process is quite important. So if they can lose a good chunk of weight early on, that's kind of builds a bit of momentum, gives them encouragement, and now number one is probably going to have a knock-on effect to their health. They're going to feel better as their weight is coming down. That increase their ability to, say, go and move a bit more, which is going to have this snowball effect. So there's lots of things going on there that might build some momentum and motivation for people, particularly who have a substantial amount of weight to lose. And it's not to say that they have to stick with a super aggressive diet. They might start with that for a few weeks, and then once they've got that buy-in and that momentum going, you may then transition them to something a bit more slow or sustainable, and then they can stick with that and they kind of trust the coach. So that would be another pro. And then, like I said, for people who want to spend longer amounts of the year in gaining phases, if they do their dieting in shorter, more aggressive blocks, then they can put more of their time towards maintenance or a gaining phase, and therefore they can kind of match that up to their training cycles. So if they're going to have a period of time where they're going to have focusing on training in whatever sport that is, keeping calories high throughout all that period, and then during times where they're either not competing or training's not a priority, being able to do an aggressive diet there. So they're just some of the different pros and cons that are worth weighing up. And I think that the thing I try and get across to people is that I'm not for or against any one of those methods. Like, they're both equally valid, and it's just being aware that they're just different tools. So whether that's for an individual, know how your psychology works, which one you prefer, or if you're a coach, knowing that for different people there's different strategies, that it's not a this is the one way to diet, or there's certain specific rules of dieting, that these are just different tools that will be good in some cases and be bad in others.
And I think that's one of the really cool things that I like about your ideology in the world of nutrition, is that you get so many people and they wholeheartedly believe in just this one method, whereas you wholeheartedly believe in principles.
Right, yeah.
And you use methods then to suit each and every individual, and it doesn't really matter what method you use as long as you follow the right principle, which I think everything in your seminar last year always came back down to the end, was none of this matters unless you follow the principles, and in a dieting phase that would be a calorie deficit. So that's just one thing that I think is really cool. And I also want to know that for people out there, that an aggressive diet, although it's a form of dieting that I enjoy, and I know yourself have done quite a few aggressive cuts yourself, it is something hard, and it isn't going to suit everybody at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think that there's so many different ways you can implement it. So like you said, it's just another tool, and it's just one specific type of method. And the reason it works is that it creates a calorie deficit, which leads to fat loss. The same way we could talk about intermittent fasting, we could talk about a low carb diet, we could talk about anything that's going to limit calorie intake, right? Or increase expenditure. And so for someone that's maybe just new to this, it doesn't mean that they have to go on like a 6-week diet on super low calories. You could still have a fairly mild calorie deficit over a week, but like what we've done before is on a few of those days diet super aggressively, and that gets people used to it, right? So they don't feel as tired because they're not dieting low on calories every day. They could, on average for that week, they might only be like, their body weight might be coming down at that half a kilo mark per week. So nice steady weight loss, nothing too hard. But on certain days for the week, they might have a day where they only eat 500 calories, or they have a kind of complete fast day. So they diet really aggressively on a few days to create most of their deficit, and then on other days it's higher. So that's a way for some people to try different forms of aggressive dieting, right? Is it aggressive diet in total, or is it just you're going to use a more aggressive calorie deficit on a few days to create still a mild deficit over the week? So again, they're all just different tools to try and get everyone to the same place, right? How can we...
Exactly. And as you're saying there, you don't just need to use the one tool at a time. You could have a sustainable or a small deficit majority of the week, and then, like you're saying, use that tool of aggressive dieting a couple of times throughout the week to just increase that calorie deficit more. So it's also not just a case of using that one tool, is that you have many different tools at your disposal.
Yeah, and that's it. It's like none of them are inherently magic or something that people have to use. It's like, okay, which one of these things is going to make it more likely that you're going to stick to this process long enough to get to your end goal, right? So whether that's cycling your calories up and down, whether that's using fasting, whether that's using shorter blocks of aggressive diets, then going back to maintenance, or whether they're doing a more prolonged mild deficit. Any of these things, they're just ways to, okay, which one is going to make it most likely that in the long term you're going to do it consistently enough and accurately enough that you're actually going to get to whatever that person's goal is. And that's all it is. Like, none of them are better or more magical than the next, you know?
So you don't have any magic answers for us, Dan?
I do, but you have to pay for them, man. sigmanutrition.com/online coaching.
Perfect. And that just brings us to the end of the video. Just tell the people out there what projects you're currently working on. I know you released a new podcast, if not a new podcast series of Sigma, and where people can find it and find the rest of your content.
Yeah, so the best place is just go to sigmanutrition.com. Everything's up there, podcasts, articles, all our online coaching stuff, information about seminars, all that stuff is up there. You'll be able to find links to me on social media. So just sigmanutrition.com is the best. If they want to find the podcasts, then like you said, we have 2 podcasts now currently running. So Sigma Nutrition Radio, you can find that pretty much on every podcast app. Just search for that. It's been around, we're at like 180 odd episodes at the moment now, mainly focused on evidence-based nutrition, whether that's looking at a researcher or a world-class coach. And then the most recent podcast that was just launched this week is the Sigma Powerlifting podcast, which is essentially taking that kind of same model, but it's going to be specifically applicable to people who are interested in raw powerlifting. So talking to world-class coaches and lifters and trying to just ask some deep, insightful questions. So that's the same deal. Just search Sigma Powerlifting Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever app, and it's all there. Or just go to the website and all the information is up there.
All right, Dan, thanks very much for coming on with me. And this is actually the second time, because the last time the video crashed and died. And I actually think we created a better video this time. So
excellent.
Thank God for my piece of shit laptop.
Go Dons.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Dan.
All right, no worries, man.